But sometimes it's not just a bad sexual experience like I didn't have an orgasm. Sometimes it's a bad sexual experience like I was sexually assaulted or I was raped. And so now we're going to kind of switch to rape culture, which is kind of our final topic from this chapter. So, rape culture, I'm going to come back to this pyramid. Let me provide a quote from a book called Transforming a Rape Culture, and it gives a great definition. Rape culture is a complex set of beliefs that encourage male sexual aggression and supports violence against women. It is a society where violence is seen as sexy and sexuality as violent. In a rape culture, women perceive a continuum of threatened violence that ranges from sexual marks to sexual touching to rape itself. So now I'm going to go back to that pyramid because this is the point. In rape culture, what is so socially acceptable is the things that you see at the bottom of the pyramid. You know, rape jokes, victim blaming, locker room banter, sexist attitudes. Those types of things become normalized. And what happens is when it becomes normalized, it creates a foundation for worse and more threatening, more violent kind of activities and behaviors. And that's what you see when you go up a level in the pyramid, because the next level would be things like catcalling, stalking, unsolicited dick pics, revenge porn, right? Things that degrade women, and it's built upon the fact that it's been normalized that women are seen in this type of society, through that kind of objectivity lens. And then we get to a higher level of the pyramid. Now we have, safe word violations, covert condom removal, groping, right? So now you are removing autonomy. You're not allowing women equal say in the sexual experience. And then finally, at the top, you have explicit violence. You know, you have your rape, you have your gang rape, you have misogynistic murder, you have just that kind of sexual assault violence. And the idea is that not that rape would not occur in a society that didn't normalize these behaviors, but it would be so much more rare. In rape culture, what is allowing those relatively high percentage of rape, molestation, sexual violence to occur is all of the people who are participating at it at its lower levels, at the levels where they can kind of make it seem like it's not a big deal, like, oh, it's just a joke, or, oh, don't be so serious, or, oh, that's just boys being boys, right? It's that foundation that allows the more explicit violence to thrive in a rape culture. So examples of rape culture can be things like blaming the victim, tolerating sexual harassment, inflating false rape report statistics, promoting gratuitous gender violence in music, movies, and television, teaching women to avoid getting raped, assuming that men don't get raped or only weak men get raped, pressuring women to not appear cold or prudish, pressuring men to score. So all of these are sexual scripts that we have in our society, more or less. And these are sexual scripts that contribute directly to rape culture. And, and when we focus just at the top of the pyramid, and ignore all of the much more likely, less intense, less violent behaviors towards the bottom of the pyramid, if we focus just at the top of the pyramid, we still have the type of numbers that just make it clear, that this is a real issue in our society. So this came up in the chapter on femininity when we discussed violence against women. So I'm not going to go back over it here, but just kind of a point that the fact that, the frequency of rape is what it is, that's the evidence that it's normal, right? That it's not out of the normal. Like, it's not like, oh, I got abducted by aliens and everybody would be like, oh my gosh, I can't believe that happened to you. Like, that is so crazy and rare. Like, unfortunately, rape in our society for women is not that. Most statistics put it somewhere between 18 to 20%. So it's normal in the sense that it's a common occurrence, and it commonly occurs, along with our other life experiences. And that's because it is not likely to be the stranger in the bushes. It's much more likely to be an intimate partner or former intimate partner, an acquaintance, which would include like a first date. Even a family member is more likely to rape a woman than a stranger. So, the fact that it's people that we routinely interact with in some way, that's part of what is contributing to the commonality. Now, another kind of piece of evidence you can kind of point to as proof of how this society was, has a long history of having a rape culture is marital rape. Because before the 1970s, most cases of marital rape were not even covered by rape laws. Like, it was a state by state kind of basis, and it took pretty much almost a decade and a half, 2 decades, for all the states to now have rape laws on the book. And that's because it was presumed that women, when they consented to get married, that they consented to sex for the entirety of their marriage. Once again, just kind of pointing out this idea that women are seen as sexual objects and not subjects. So because of that kind of lack of sexual subjectivity and agency, marital rape was just kind of like unheard of. Like, it was just like a concept that didn't exist. Now, of course, rape within marriage is now illegal, in all the states. But because of cultural beliefs held by many, convictions are still difficult to obtain. And in a lot of cases, a lot of women don't even come forward. In a lot of cases, they aren't even necessarily comfortable using the word rape to describe what their husband did to them. Instead, they talk about stories like, I really wasn't interested, or I was half asleep, or I woke up to him doing this and I wasn't that into it. Nobody wants to necessarily define their husband as being a rapist, particularly if the rape did not come along with, explicit violence. And so in that way, that old idea that rape within marriage is impossible, even though we changed the laws, the idea itself has persisted, right? That, there is still that kind of sexual script. Now, I mentioned the fact that, marital rape is people rarely come forward and it's rarely convicted, but it's just worth noting that that's generally the case with rape in general. It is underreported crime, and it is a under, it is an underreported crime, and it's the type of crime where oftentimes it is not likely to result in a conviction. And if it does result in a conviction, it's highly unlikely, that the perpetrator will spend any real significant time in jail. And so, these statistics kind of tweak every couple of years, but in general, about a little under half of the rapes get reported to the police. So when we compare the data that we have on, women who say they've been raped versus police statistics, it's under half. And then when it does get reported to the police, a lot of them don't lead to an arrest, because oftentimes there is what is considered to be a lack of good evidence, and police have historically been very reluctant to pursue cases that are largely just based on what's perceived to be he said, she said, differences in opinion and stories types of cases. Of the ones that do lead to an arrest, then only, the 12%, that do, then only 9% get prosecuted, because even once the police maybe make the arrest, the prosecutor has to decide, to take the case. And, is it a good enough case to go to trial? And then once at trial, they then have to convince a jury to convict. Only about 5% lead to a felony conviction. People plead down, they accept plea deals, and oftentimes they're just found not guilty. And this was, especially more likely to be, the case in previous decades, pre-Me Too in particular. There was this sense that, if it wasn't a violent stranger danger type of rape, if you're talking about a rape that occurred at a party or, on a date, there was a lot of victim blaming, and there was this strategy that defense attorneys would use, the nut versus slut strategy, where they would either try to paint the female victim out to be crazy or to paint her out to be, sexually promiscuous, a whore. And, going back to that kind of, rape myth or, sexual script, around rape victims, is that idea of like, can a whore, can she really be raped? And so that was a successful way to get their clients off. And then, even if there was a felony conviction, doesn't necessarily mean that the rapist will spend even a single day in prison. And then we won't even talk about the ones who then spend significant time in prison. Just think back to that Brock Turner case, and, even with witnesses, and for that sexual assault, 6 months, but then was out in 3. So, all of that, of course, just leads to people being much less willing to come forward for this type of crime, versus, getting your purse snatched or your car broken into. And it's not like murder where there's this clear piece of evidence, a missing person or a dead body, which kind of makes the police have to, press charges and look to make an arrest. So all of this, that just kind of complicates, the kind of policing around rape. But, if we specifically return back to our campus and focus on campus and hookup culture, when we look at our college statistics, it becomes 1 out of 5 women and 1 in 16 men. And there is a unique form of rape that often happens in these college and in some cases even high school settings, and it's called party rape. And this is rapes that occur in the context of a party. Oftentimes they involve a victim and sometimes a perpetrator who, are incapacitated with alcohol, in some cases drugs. And so particularly for this type of rape, there are kind of 2 theories, and both of them have some support when you look at the data. So one theory is that rape is a crime committed by dangerous psychopaths, that colleges just have a certain percentage of serial rapists. And, based on data, 4% of college men do admit to more than one act of sexual violence. And among that sample of men, the average is 6 rapes each. So there definitely seems to be some men who are going to college and are raping multiple women and are aware that is what they are doing. But then with party rape, there's also this other theory, and that's that rape is situational. So, I'm not saying that it's not a crime, but, what does that mean? Rape is situational. This is where the role of alcohol plays a big part, because oftentimes when both parties have been drinking, and then you add to that those sexual scripts that men and women have been raised within the society, the push and resist script, the sexual double standard, the woman as sexual object but not sexual subject. It can lead to people making bad decisions, criminal decisions in the case of rape, and that they do not necessarily always recognize in that moment that is what they are doing, and that they are in that moment committing a crime. And we'll talk more about that in a second. But, once again, you can point the finger also to larger social forces, because we do have in our media, we present these types of this situational rape as if it's normal, as if it's not problematic, as if it's not criminal. The whole plot of that movie, Superbad, which, I'll admit I watched the movie and I laughed at parts of it. But, that whole plot was about them, tracking down alcohol to get these girls drunk enough to agree to have sex with them. And that is problematic. And the fact that that's presented as okay, and the fact that that is a contemporary sexual script, this idea that you ply a woman with alcohol to get her drunk enough to say yes, even though, of course, that flies in the face of what consent is supposed to look like. So in this way, hookup culture is implicated in both theories. And that's the point that your book makes. Hookup culture is rape culture on college campuses. And that's because, hookup culture allows rape culture to hide in plain sight. It's hard to tell the difference between one of those psychopath serial rapists and just, a regular guy looking for a hookup. And it's hard for that regular guy to necessarily know that he is in a situation where he doesn't really have consent if we put out these messages that in hookup culture, you're supposed to be drunk. You're supposed to be having fun. You're supposed to be having this drunken sex, even though, of course, that type of sexual activity flies in the face of our consent laws. And so all of this it just relates to, once again, those gendered sexual scripts. There's a saying, a man who hesitates masturbates. And once again, that focus on, for men, they receive those messages that they're always supposed to be pushing for sex. They're not supposed to take no for an answer. That they're taught that of course she's going to say no. She wants to come across as a good girl. So they're taught that push and resist dynamic, that they're supposed to be the pushers. They're supposed to keep trying to overcome her resistance. So it raises the question, do nice guys, good men know when they cross the line? If what they're taught is to be manly, you should be, going right up to the line. You should be pushing it. You should be pushing boundaries, because that's what men do. They go after sex. They pursue sex. They're aggressor. They're sexually aggressive. And you can't expect women to be sexually aggressive, because we have this gendered message that that's not what women do. Obviously what it does is it does create the context where, what they might be perceiving as a ploy or a strategy on the woman's part is not a ploy or a strategy. That they are in fact assaulting her. And research does show that of the men who admit that they did commit rape, most of them are not those 4% who are serial rapists. They're 4 out of 5 who commit rape before graduating, and they do so one time. And oftentimes when you get their stories, they align with that situational theory. Lots about alcohol and misread communication and signals and misinterpreting. And of course, none of that helps, of course, the woman who was victimized in that situation, right? The fact that he only did it once, that does not make her feel any better. But what it does do is it emphasizes, of course, that, we do need new sexual scripts, particularly around consent. And so, colleges in particular have attempted to do this. California was one of the first states that transitioned from no means no to yes means yes, because no means no required someone to answer in the negative, to tell someone, no, stop doing that. Now, first of all, that was problematic in the sense of, like, what if you were drunk or passed out, or for a lot of women who, maybe did not feel comfortable shutting things down. What about if they gave a tentative, verbal hedge, which we do know from communication patterns, women are more likely to do. So what if they said things like, I don't think we should do this, or I'm not sure if I want to do this, or, maybe we should, wait, right? None of those are necessarily explicit no's, but clearly they're not a yes. So yes means yes. the word for this is affirmative consent. It's the idea that you should be waiting to see if someone is going to give you specific, enthusiastic, non-coerced consent to engage in a sexual act. Now the problem is, this is coming from someone that when I left CSUB, a year and a half ago, I initially left and took a job where that was my job. I was the interpersonal violence coordinator at a campus, and I would go around, and part of what I would do is I would do consent workshops. But part of that yes means yes is that sexual script, that policy does not align with the sexual scripts that we are still feeding women, because yes means yes means, embracing your sexual agency, embracing your sexual subjectivity, stating your desires and making them plain, not playing the push and resist game, and that means potentially, by putting your desires out there, it means perhaps running afoul of the sexual double standard. So, part of the struggle with getting college students to embrace the yes means yes versus the no means no laws is because it's running counter to some of those other sexual scripts. And this is just a funny image that a student once included on a assignment. But it just once again shows that when we've given this sexual script for men to keep pushing, for men to be aggressors, when we've set it up that, it's advantageous to them to not take the first no for an answer, it does lead to these situations where, there's this thin line between, going for it and being a sexual predator. So, how do colleges try to combat this? Certainly, bystander intervention, so teaching people to be active bystanders that get involved when they see something, is the most effective way. However, a lot of students just choose to not get involved. And we know this because there have been so many cases where students, have leaked photos and cell phone footage where they are clearly witnessing sexual assaults, but they're not doing anything. These sexual assaults are occurring at a party, and instead of students stopping them, they're taping, they're laughing, they're not stopping the crime, or in a lot of cases they're not even reporting it. Once again, this is where party culture, hookup culture, and rape culture, where that conflation can just become very problematic. Some students view this as part of the fun of the party culture, that you're going to witness, people doing crazy things, girls and guys getting crazy. And this idea that, this can just be a crazy thing that's going on, this impacts people's willingness to be active bystanders, right? Because nobody wants to be, the fun cop. Nobody wants to stop the fun. And so, that's part of what makes bystander intervention, hard to successfully implement on campuses. The other reason why college rapists get away with it is the role of power and influence. A large percentage of the serial rapists, that 4% that we've talked about, were oftentimes male students who had power and influence on campus. Predominantly, it was men who were involved in the Greek system, which we've already explained, the kind of central role that Greeks that have houses play on residential campuses. And then also student athletes, particularly in the sports that are associated with money-making sports, your basketballs and your footballs and your baseballs, if you will. And so what happens is that those students in particular are more likely to feel like that they are advantaged in the erotic marketplace. So they, are more likely to perceive women as being sexual objects, kind of there for them, the comparative to other men. But it also, when they become serial rapists, it makes it less likely that other students will get involved, that they'll be reported. And unfortunately, it even makes it less likely that the schools, the universities will do anything if people make those reports. And that has certainly been an issue that Title IX in the last 10 years has tried to push back against. If we look beyond college campuses, we can see this play out on the national stage, with cases like Bill Cosby and Harvey Weinstein and Roman Polanski and R. Kelly. And, there have been all these cases where, you wonder how can someone, rack up that long of a list of victims. But it was because for such a long period of time, they were protected by their power and their influence. Their power and influence gave them greater access to women who did not perhaps know that they were going to be victimized, but then it also gave them greater protection, once that victimization took place. Which brings me to my final point, which is about victims. Because the other reason why rapists get away with it is because oftentimes victims do not want to come forward. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that, particularly in college campuses with your party culture and your hookup culture, you don't have what's considered to be a perfect victim. A perfect victim is someone that was, dressed in non-provocative clothing, going about their daily routine when they are attacked or accosted by a stranger, and they hadn't been drinking and they hadn't been doing drugs, and they don't have a problematic sexual, history or past. So that's what the perfect victim looks like, because then when people hear her rape story, what's unlikely to happen is victim blaming. But the fact of the matter is that is not the story of most victims. Instead of the perfect victim, what we often have is a typical victim. And especially if you're talking about the typical victim on a residential college campus, it is oftentimes a young woman that was at a party. She had been drinking. She perhaps was dressed in provocative clothing. And none of that means that someone had the right to rape her. But unfortunately, what it does mean is that if she comes forward, if she becomes part of that less than half who come forward to the police who report, she has to deal with the scrutiny of having all of those actions, all of those ways in which she's not the perfect victim. She has to deal with having all of that scrutinized. Because victim blaming and slut shaming, which kind of go hand in hand, in terms of sexual scripts. Those are contemporary sexual scripts. We oftentimes blame the victim, and we talked about that in chapter 7, particularly why women blame the victim as well as men, giving them that false sense of security. Well, I'm not that type of girl, and that will never happen to me. But in reality, in rape culture, with 20% of women having a rape, happening to them at some point in their lives, the fact of the matter is, it's a false sense of security. There is no perfect way to avoid, being raped. And once again, the fact that we teach women to avoid being raped versus teaching men to not rape, is a sexual script. And so, that question, which, I didn't start the chapter off with, but, this is where we'll end, that question for this chapter, gendered ideas, interactions, and institutions may affect almost every part of my life, but some things are personal and my sexuality is mine and mine alone, isn't it? Well, the clear-cut answer here is no. Whether you're talking about sexual scripts, whether you're talking about sexual norms, whether you're talking about changing kind of perceptions of sexual deviance, whether you're talking about the creation and construction of different sexual identity terms, right? All of that is social, all of that is sociological, right? Obviously you have some individual choice here. It's not like you're stripped of all your agency, but that agency, like everything else in your life, it is occurring in a larger social context. So I know this chapter was pretty lengthy, but hopefully I did a good job of explaining the material from the book, even though I didn't present it in the same order as the authors, as well as the additional material that I provided you.